What's going on, people? As always, happy Monday and welcome back to another episode of the Athletes to Athletes podcast. Today, I talk with Natalie Allport, who grew up a hockey player in Canada before switching to snowboarding, but is now a CrossFit athlete, content creator, and podcast host, among so much more. She discusses her extreme sports background and how she created a platform during the downtimes of the COVID pandemic. So again, welcome back to the A2A podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. So we're back, another A2A podcast, and today sitting down with Natalie Allport. Natalie, it's great to meet you. It's awesome that you have taken time out of your very, very busy schedule to come on and talk to us about your sports career, your podcast, and everything else that you are involved in. So as usual, I'm actually going to pass it off to you to kind of introduce yourself to the audience, tell us where you're from, a little bit about your sports background, and then we'll get rolling.
Awesome. Well, no, first off, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm based out of Ottawa, Canada, but I was actually born on the West Coast, Vancouver. Turned out to be a snowboarder, but actually started snowboarding not there. I started skiing when I was there, but when we were 6, we moved away over to the east side and started snowboarding over here. So I grew up playing every sport. Hockey was the main one, but then when I found snowboarding, I had to kind of make that decision of what winter sport will I do? I think many multi-sport athletes can relate of like trying to figure out which sport is the one that they're going to choose. So I picked the one that I was actually the worst at of all the sports to the detriment of my parents, especially, hockey has a NCAA track. There's a scholarship track. And I picked that one sport that was very different than the typical college sports track. So pursued that at 17, got onto the junior national team, spent 4 seasons with the national team program, trying to qualify for the Olympics. Unfortunately, fell short of the 2014 Olympics. I competed at the World Cup circuit, World Tour circuit. And then in 2015, I made the really tough decision to walk away from that sport. Transitioned into, a bunch of different things. I went through the typical athlete transition, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but transitioned into competing into CrossFit, which is what I do to this day. Although I've been on the comeback because I've been going through an injury throughout the pandemic, and also started an agency way back, actually my last season of snowboarding, 93 Agency, which is a marketing agency that has taken a lot of different pivots along its path, but right now focuses on the athlete and sports marketing space. Aside from that, I do a lot of speaking, content creation. I joke that most of my day is spent training and filming videos, and that's pretty much what I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I had a chance to obviously dig into your story and getting on your website. So I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit to something that really stuck out for me that's different from other athletes. Obviously, going the hockey track and the snowboarding track, everything, that's obviously different. But a lot of athletes, they don't know that they want to be an Olympic sport athlete until they get to a certain point, right? I have friends who are Olympic gold medalists in wrestling, and it wasn't until much later on that they were like, this is something that I can pursue, right? For you, like I said, I read your story. You knew that you wanted to go to the Olympics when you were 3 years old. How does that start? I mean, obviously you're very far away from 3 years old, but what do you remember about being that young and knowing that's where I want to be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's something, my parents told me. They're like, yeah, when you were 3 years old, this is what you told us. You were watching the Olympics. I think apparently I was on my tricycle and I was going around and around and around watching the Olympics on TV. And I said, I had no idea what sport then, but I just was like, I want to be there. I want to be an athlete. But I was always active. I mean, I grew up with ADHD, so I was super active, playing literally every single sport. My parents were very supportive. My mom didn't grow up super sporty. She's from Venezuela. I do think she played, a little bit of sports at school that you had to kind of in PE and stuff like that, but she's very far away from being competitive versus I'm the opposite. I'm super competitive, and that comes a lot from my dad's side. He grew up in a small town playing, football, hockey, basketball, baseball, every sport. That's what you kind of do. And so I'm the firstborn child in my family. And I think he kind of immediately was getting me into sports. But I think, from day one, he always tells me he could see that I always wanted to be active and needed that outlet. So he always jokes about like I was doing sit-ups like a week, a week after they took me home. And he always jokes, he was like doing the leg press with me on the bed and pushing my legs. So, it's kind of like that discussion of nature versus nurture. And I think it was a little bit of both, but I think just naturally my energy gravitated towards that outlet of sports. And so when I set that goal, it was kind of like, okay, now let me find my path of which sport that might be in. And for a long time, I believed that to be hockey. And then actually when I transitioned into snowboarding, the type of snowboarding I did wasn't currently in the Olympics. So that was like also a hard hit for my parents, because that goal that I had set suddenly was like, okay, she wants to be a professional at this sport, but she has that Olympic goal and there's not that Olympic. So they're a little bit worried about, what that culture would be like, would she just be like a ski bum or something like that? But then actually it was the summer right before, like a month before I got named to the junior national team, that they announced that my type of snowboarding, slopestyle snowboarding, so all the jumps and the rails, would get included into the next Olympics. And so that's when all of a sudden they formed the national team program and everything for my discipline. And then I was able to keep competing in that discipline.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were a pretty fearless kid, and that continued throughout your life and throughout basically everything that you do, from moving from skiing and hockey to snowboarding and being on rails and jumps and everything else. Was that, and you mentioned the nature versus nurture thing, was that something that your parents continued to instill in you as you grew up of, you can go out and do absolutely anything you want? Or was it something you were just like around your friends that were doing these things and it came more from a friendship thing than it did from your parents?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a bit of both. I think it was kind of like a natural inclination, because it's funny now because I feel a lot more fearful than my younger brother. But growing, because now he does like he skis. He's not as competitive, but he does all the extreme sports. He rock climbs, he skis, he does like cliff jumping, and he does mountain biking, downhill mountain biking, and everything. And he's much more fearless than I am now. Like I'm like, I don't want to hurt myself. I've had all those experiences with tons of broken bones and things in the past. Meanwhile, he's just like still sending it with his friends and pushing it a little bit more than I feel comfortable doing so. But as kids, we were the opposite. His learning style is like watching things, studying them, and then like feeling comfortable to do things. I always learned the hard way. Like I'm like, let me jump in the water and see if I drown and try to figure it out. And
Yeah.
I think that's just kind of what my personality was growing up. And my dad would like to challenge that. He always like told me, oh, you can't do this, just to like get me more motivated, because I always perform better under pressure. So he nurtured that in a way. And I think also a lot of my friends at school, especially like the group of girls I hung out with, none of them were really that into sports. I, had my sports friends aside. So I think it was a little bit of just kind of, that was my natural personality, but it did, it changed throughout the years. My tolerance for fear, like I mentioned, has lessened as I got into my 20s. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, going that hockey track, what made you fall in love with hockey originally before transitioning to, snowboarding and skiing and everything else? And what type of structure is there for hockey in Canada? Because, I mean, hockey in Canada, they fit like a glove. Everybody knows that. What kind of structure is there for that as a kid growing up playing hockey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the main sport of Canada. So it was a pretty natural, decision for my parents to put me in hockey. My dad grew up, playing hockey and then playing competitive hockey. So, you had the little mini sticks and the sticks growing up, and we'd be playing pass and like playing in the driveway. And that's what kind of all the friends did. That's what my younger brother wanted to do. My parents taught me how to skate on ice very, very young. So it was, I don't know what it was that I really fell in love with, but it was like, that was kind of like one of the first organized sports other than soccer that my parents put me into. And then from day one, I just really liked it. I, made friends. I loved the camaraderie of, having the teammates and, pursuing these things with other people. So it's kind of funny that I ended up in individual sports after that, but I really do miss that team aspect. And then everyone at my school, everyone was into hockey, especially all the boys were into hockey as well. And it just kind of became my whole personality. That's kind of who I am, is whatever I'm into kind of overtakes my life, to the point, if you're at school and you're in English class and you're writing an essay or you're doing poems, like mine were about hockey. Everything was about hockey. I was known as like the hockey girl at my school. And yeah, so then I just kind of pursued that. But there's there's definitely, I mean, much better than snowboarding. There's a track that's kind of figured out, right? Like you have your club teams, you have their different levels, and you're traveling and competing, at a certain regular intervals. You have a certain amount of practices a week. You have a certain amount of tournaments that you're traveling to per year. There's also like high school hockey, but high school hockey in Canada isn't looked at like the same as like high school sports in the States. Like people aren't coming to recruit people from high school. They're coming to the club hockey games and stuff like that. High school was kind of just for fun. We had people of all different, levels, from people who went on to play for Princeton in hockey to people who we had to purchase equipment just to get them as an extra player on the team. So like we had a wide range in high school hockey. But yeah, there's a pretty good system here in Canada of, building up players and having tons of opportunities. Especially if you live like in Ottawa, it's the capital of Canada. So there's a lot of teams that you can choose from depending where you live. So it's an expensive sport for sure, but it's, more accessible than a sport like snowboarding.
Mm-hmm. So how old were you when you decided that it was going to be snowboarding instead of hockey? And, as you said, it was what you were the worst at. What made you go that route of most resistance?
Yeah, I think I was about 13 when I made the decision. I actually picked up snowboarding not until I was like 12, which is in nowadays, it's late. Like you're going professional at 12. You see the young kids,
Yeah.
like it's crazy. If you scroll social media, right, you like see some kid doing some crazy flips and then you're like, oh my God, they're 11. Like how they're doing crazier things than I did when I stepped away from the sport. So it's the level of progression now is absolutely insane. You have to start so young, but the sport was really developing still and it's still developing, but when I started it, and I don't know what it was, but it was like this freedom. I had played so many structured sports my whole life, and suddenly, I kind of got to decide. I had creative freedom. I was still able to be competitive, and I was competitive one-on-one with other people. So that was really cool. I think just, going to the hill was always a fun experience. And then what I tried to do is I had actually a negative experience in hockey where I was pretty small. I went through a very late growth spurt. And so I had a coach who kind of told me I was too small. And even though I was one of the top scorers, I wasn't getting as many playing hours. And it just really was really frustrating. And it was at that time that I'd first discovered snowboarding. But as I was like falling in love with it, I would be like daydreaming about it in class, again, like this obsession with whatever I was currently into. I was realizing I didn't have the time to do it because I was playing hockey like, 5-6 days a week. So I was like, okay, how can I, try to snowboard more? And you would snowboard like 2 times in the season. So I told my parents, maybe next year I'll play a lower level of competitive, still competitive, but a lower level. But then I felt like I wasn't being challenged as much. And I really liked that challenge. So then it was the decision of, okay, do I try to catch up with all my peers and get back to, playing AA, AAA? Or do I try to pursue this new sport that like seems to be taking up all my attention? And so even though I wasn't good at the time, I just had like this vision in my head of like, I could get there if I put in the work. And so I ended up, being like, okay, I'm going to commit to this and I'm going to try to get better at it.
Mm-hmm. So balancing being an athlete that, has some structure to it. Like you said, there's a system for hockey. There's not a system for snowboarding. You have your own schedule, your own travel schedule, and everything else that you need to do. How do you balance that? I think you said you were 12 or 13 when you decided to go that route. How do you balance school and a sport that takes a lot of time to master, especially somebody who says they weren't very good at it at first? How does that balance out?
Yeah. So for me, like I grew up in this small townhome and there we had like 3 steps to get into the backyard, but all our neighbors had fenced off their backyard. So I actually like my grandpa welded me a skateboard rail and I put it in the backyard and used it as a snowboard rail. And I would like use my arms, get some speed down those like 3 steps and like practice on that rail like every day. And then he had built me like a bike jump and I would put snow over it and like practice. And then I would go to the toboggan hill like near me and I would try to go because again I don't live near the mountains. Also, like Ottawa isn't known for big mountains, so even the hills that are half an hour away, 1 hour away, they're not that big. So I was like building jumps and doing different things just like where I could with my friends, like taking, bike racks and like trying to use them as rails and like hitting street rails over staircases and just practicing like any way I could. And then another thing that really made it a little bit easier for my parents was that I got a job at the ski resort instructing and coaching. So then it was like, okay, well, we're driving her here like every night after school or on the weekends or throughout all of the March break and Christmas break because she's working. But, in between all the times I was working, when I was working, I was on my board still spending time on my feet. But then I would be going and practicing and practicing and practicing. And at that time, I could never do it now, but I had so much energy that I would ride, 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day. So I got to spend a lot of time on my snowboard.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, especially for a young kid, to be coaching and training people and then training yourself. But what was it that, or at least when did you kind of figure out that you were going to be able to compete in this, right? Everyone has that sort of epiphany of, okay, I'm good enough to compete against other people. Here in the States, obviously things are structured. You're on a team, you're going to compete. For you, you have to have your coaches, your parents, and your own kind of wherewithal to know, okay, it's time to take this to the next level. When does that happen for you? And how do you figure out that it's time to, take that step and start competing?
Yeah, so like all along the journey, I kind of did like small competitions at my local hill, but often I'd be like one of like four girls, and so I was winning, and I'd be kind of like the big fish in a small pond in a sense of, okay, there's only like 4 or 5 girls competing. I was often winning, so all of a sudden I started kind of overreaching and like, okay, let's enter some competitions that I have to drive a little bit further to get to or travel to, and so I, convinced my parents to get me there, and they drove me to this one competition, and I had all these big hopes. Like I always had built up the Cinderella story in my head, like I did at that time of like, all of a sudden this unknown person comes to this competition and she wins it, and oh my God, now she has a pro career. And I fell in all my runs and came like dead last. And I remember just like crying and crying. And my favorite pro snowboarder was there. My mom's like, Natalie, you need to go get a picture with her. Like she has a quote you've printed her picture on your wall. I'm like, this is so embarrassing. And I just remember that feeling and thinking, I'm going to train really hard and I'm going to come back next year and I want to win. Like I want to make that dream come true this year. So then it was that next season that I finally had convinced my parents to let me travel a little bit further. And I also had convinced, I guess it was my last year of high school, I convinced my guidance counselor as well to kind of like have that belief in me, that we sat down with my parents and basically talked with the school. And I ended up taking online courses that summer so that I could graduate high school a semester early. I walked the stage the same time as my friends, but I had no classes the last semester. So then I was able to like get a job to try to pay for the travel I wanted to do, as well as go to a couple competitions out west during the time that everyone else would have been in class. So I basically like finished school, after the first semester. That next semester I started traveling. I actually broke my tailbone. I came back. I had 2 weeks to recover before this competition. But I had learned a new trick while I was out west just before I had broken my tailbone. I get to this competition. I ended up landing the run. I can still like picture it in my head because it was such a inflow moment, and ended up, winning my first big amount of prize money for me at the time. This like big check. I actually have it in front of my like on my wall right now in front of me. It was a competition sponsored by Billabong, and the year after I actually ended up signing a contract with Billabong. We got flown out to California for another competition, and it turned out actually at that time that unknowingly it launched my career, because it was just a few months after that slopestyle snowboarding got announced to be in the Olympics. And a month after that I got put on the junior national team, and it was because of those results. But at the time, I had no idea of the structure. Like I didn't know if I get these results, it'll put me in contention for this team. Because at the time, there was no team. So it was just the reflection that pushing through that injury, landing that run, things just coming together, ended up putting me on that path. And then there started to become more of a structure. All of a sudden, I had to hire a coach, because for insurance reasons, once you're competing at World Cups and different things, you have to have a coach. So I had to figure that out. I had to, I'm going to junior worlds around the world. Like I was just doing these local competitions, and all of a sudden I was kind of thrown into competing against all the girls that I had up in magazines all around my world. Or all around my room. So it was like I transitioned from one world to another really fast, and it was a hard transition.
Yeah. What's that like when you kind of grew up looking at all of these different girls competing, and now you're in that setting with them? What is it? Is it a culture shock? How nervous are you? What's that like, making that transition so fast, or at least as quickly as you did?
Yeah, it's really hard. Like I mean, I struggle with that for my entire career because again, I had this Cinderella story built in my head and it didn't happen that one year, but it did happen the next year where I came back and won it after saying that's what I wanted to do. So I went from, kind of being this big fish in a small pond, like I mentioned before, to being thrown into this world where it's like, it's good to get 30th place. Like you're 30th in the world. Like that's a good place, but I'm frustrated because I've gone from winning all these competitions and so I think that's really hard and something a lot of athletes can relate to when you go from, maybe being the best at your high school and all of a sudden you go to college and you're sitting on the bench or you're fighting for playing minutes or you are playing but you're not performing at the same level. It takes an adjustment to realize and like be almost like you still have that big dream in your head like okay, I can progress, I can make it, but also like humble yourself and recognize like this is the level I'm at, this is everyone here is good and I have to work
Hmm.
twice as hard and I need to like have patience with myself that it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah. I mean, you're exactly right. Everyone kind of has that I'm the all-star, and then you get to college and everyone's an all-star.
Yeah.
So, you had to go through that pretty quickly. But then how else did things change? You said, you had to hire a coach after winning all of these other tournaments. How does this change, your structure and everything that you're doing? And how do you face the transition, not just physically, but obviously it's a mental toll as well. How do you face all of these things and all these new factors?
Yeah, it was really hard. I was lucky to have coaches that, actually that year my parents were like sat me down. They're like, we need to hire also, a strength and conditioning coach. You need to go in the gym. You want to prevent injuries. And that's what got me into training. But the strength and conditioning coach at the time that we decided to work with, she was going to school for her master's in sports psychology. So whenever I pick her up, she didn't have a car. I would borrow my dad's car and I would pick her up in the mornings to go to the university gym. And, she would give me my homework of sports psychology. Like, did you visualize, like, how are you feeling? And she would check in with me. And so I learned some of that stuff. And then when I actually hired a coach, I ended up moving down kind of like 7-ish hours away from home to where this coach was. And I ended up living at his parents' house. And so spending time in the car with the coach, he was helping me with, the mental side of things and just like being so immersed in that side of all of a sudden, like my whole day to day is just snowboarding and just training. I was able to work a little bit on that side, but it took a long time. And especially, we had a couple coaches that we worked with with that program. And actually the other coach, the head coach, he really humbled me by putting me in the group with a lot of the kids. And I was like, why am I with like these young kids? Like I'm on, part of the national team program. Like he's like, you've never had proper coaching. You need to relearn the basics, like how to take off a jump, how to turn initiate, how to do these movements because you need to build this foundation that we can layer things on to. And, for me, I was like, okay, I won this competition. How can I win these next big ones? Let me learn this next big trick. And he's like, no, 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 no. We're not learning some next big trick. We're relearning all these other ones before you can get there. So it was a really humbling experience. And it really had to kind of rebuild my mindset from square one.
Hmm. So let's dig into your career. How does everything move as fast as it did for you? I mean, you said you're winning a lot of these tournaments. You're getting a new coach. You're getting a couple new coaches. As you go throughout your career, what type of success are you seeing? And how is this affecting you? A lot of people get success and they're like, I'm doing great. I'm awesome. But then other people, myself included, you're like, man, I'm doing great, but like you have kind of that imposter syndrome. Do I deserve this? Am I supposed to be here? Those types of things kind of start to creep in. Is that the kind of thing that kind of happened with you as you were getting better? You're relearning the basics, and are you getting super confident, but you're still fighting a lot of these battles?
Yeah, 100%. I'm competing against people again, like who I had printed in magazines, and then the other riders who were younger like me and coming up, they've been snowboarding forever. Like they've known they wanted to do this since they were a kid. They have, maybe they came from families that were sending them all around the world to snowboard. They had coaches since they were 6. Like, it was just totally different experience than I had. And that was really, really hard to deal with, especially, I had to work to try to pay for all my things. My parents were like, we want to support you 100%, but this is a really expensive sport and we can't pay to fly you around the world like some of the other parents can. And so, I had to figure that out. And so it was also dealing with the fact that a lot of my competitors were spending double the time on snow that I was, because all summer I was home working and they were in Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Austria, doing all these other extra competitions and trainings. And so, yeah, I was having to deal with that. I was having to deal with a bunch of injuries. So it was kind of like, that peak moment of like, oh my gosh, everything's going great. All of a sudden I make it there. And then I had all these things kind of stack on that I had never dealt with: the politics of the sports, the financial aspects of the sports, the comparison, the imposter syndrome. It was all compounding, and it really, I mean, I spent 4 years there kind of, competing at that top level. And I wouldn't say that it got better during that time. It's actually really what led me to leaving that sport early in my career. And it's something that I've really, really tried to work on as I go through, the next phase of my life and in this new sports career.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, like I said, I did my research on you, and within reading that, you have a lot in there, or some parts in there about dealing with those mental health issues that you didn't even know you were going through. Let's dig into that a little bit. How did you finally figure out that you had some of these issues that you didn't know were there, and what did you do and what steps did you take to kind of get yourself out of the dark places that you ended up being in?
Yeah, right. Like, it's easy to talk about it in reflection and be like, I was going through imposter syndrome. I was going through, the politics and all this stuff. But when I was in it, you were just going through it, and I had no idea what it was. I didn't, hear people talk about mental health in sports. I definitely have heard people talk about mental health in general. It wasn't as big of a conversation as it was now, but it definitely wasn't in the conversation in sports, right? Like, a lot of people back home would say, oh my God, your life is so amazing. You're traveling the world. You're doing this. They didn't have any idea what I was, how hard I was working, budgeting and spreadsheeting and trying to figure out how I can get to the next competition, how I can pay my coaches, the politics that went on. I win a competition and then they say, oh no, we wrote out the leaderboard wrong and it went like this so that someone else could get funding. And it was like all these crazy things that are happening that people don't see that really affected me. And one of the biggest one is just the stack up of injuries and not knowing how to deal with that, because in an extreme sport like snowboarding, you just push through. And like in any sport, you push through, but in snowboarding, it's high fear, high danger. People die, people land on their heads. I've, been first person, first responder on a lot of friends' injuries, like dislocated hips, people coughing out blood and not knowing where they are. Like, you see like really traumatic things in snowboarding. And at the time it was just normalized. Like, you just normalize these things because that's part of the sport. And so I didn't really realize that it was so crazy that, like, I competed 2 weeks after breaking my tailbone. I'm competing with concussions and doing things that really you probably shouldn't have been doing, until I kind of stepped out and had a little bit of a break from it. So I had this kind of big injury. I came back to sport. I then, I missed out on the 2014 Olympics. And then I actually started doing CrossFit. And like, through doing that sport, I started really liking it. I built this community of different people in a different sport, in a different area. And all of a sudden, when I came back to snowboarding, something felt different. And everything kind of felt like I was looking at it from a whole new perspective, like from a third party perspective. And I started seeing like, oh yeah, when my mom says all this stuff I'm doing is crazy, it is actually kind of crazy. Yeah. And I started realizing, like, I started looking back at some past journals to try to understand, why am I feeling like this? Why is this passion for the sport not quite there right now? Why am I so scared? Why am I making excuses? Like, that's not who I want to be. I want to be a hard worker. I want to show up for my coaches. I want to show up for myself. But I'm like, I had one little ache or issue, and I'd be like, oh no, I'm going to go down to the physio room and just do this, which is not how I was early on in my career. So I wanted to figure it out. And I look back at past journals and I could see this reoccurring theme of just kind of feeling homesick, feeling kind of depressed, feeling really anxious, not ever processing the injuries I went through. So every time I'm dropping in now, I'm having flashbacks of like the 10 other times that I've fallen or gotten hurt on that same thing. And I have to work through that every single time I'm trying to work this trick again. And so not until it was like after that all compounded and I said, okay, you know what, something's going on here. Maybe leaving will help. And when I left, I went through that whole athlete transition of identity and everything, and things got worse. That then going through therapy and looking back, I started realizing, wait a second, I am just experiencing the compounding effects of all these things that I have just not processed because I didn't know
Hmm.
that they were not normal, or they weren't, at least they were normal, but things that you can deal with through doing therapy and talking through it and processing them, rather than just like sweeping them under the rug until one day you got to look under there and deal with them all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. Everybody, like I said, myself included, you go through those times where you're like, I don't know which end is up. I'm now afraid to go out there and compete, and it takes a lot to get over that. So, you said you started going to therapy and really figuring out these things, and having that 30,000 foot view on a sport you used to love when you came back into it was very different. And then you start to transition into CrossFit. What was it about CrossFit? I know you said you started building that community, but what was the same thing that happened with hockey, that happened with snowboarding? What was it, the same feeling that you had with those two sports that made you fall in love with doing CrossFit?
Yeah, I think it's funny because, I love snowboarding, right? But I wasn't necessarily a natural at it. But through like working hard and yeah, having for sure some talent, I was able to make it to the level that I did. But when I always had this little bit of like resentment when I left, and also like looking back at my journals of wondering, should I have stuck with a sport that is more natural to me? I always had this Olympic dream. I always had this dream of being an athlete. And so when things started not feeling as right for me in snowboarding, I was like, what, I still want to be an athlete. What's that next thing? And when I started CrossFit, it really just clicked. Like I was naturally pretty good at it. I was putting up competitive scores. I was naturally pretty strong. I'd always, like with my snowboard training, I had trained really hard to try to prevent a lot of preventable injuries, like, strengthening my muscles and joints. I definitely still have a lot of broken bones that are kind of unavoidable, but
Yeah.
um, some of the ones that a lot of my competitors were, the ACLs and MCLs are very big, especially in women's snowboarding. I was able to avoid, and I think that I owe that a lot to the strength training. And so I started really falling in love with that whole aspect of training. And it was something that a lot of the people noticed. Even if I go back today to the national team training center, they'll be like, oh, you were that snowboarder who was always in the gym, like who loved training almost more than being out on snow. I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. So I just had this natural inclination to it, and it took to it, and I felt natural at it. So I just started pursuing that. And it's something that really helped give me an outlet when I was dealing with depression and anxiety and the loss of identity when I stepped away from snowboarding. It also was a little bit of a crutch too, and I've been really unpacking that over this past injury and the pandemic of some of my why at the originally was also just to I went from being this like at the highest level of one sport, and I wasn't ready to just transition to something completely different. So I was able to just,
Hmm.
especially tell my snowboard friends, they thought they're like, oh, Nat's really good at CrossFit. She could make, a equally as successful career in this. So she transitioned to that. They didn't realize it was because of all the mental health injury issues and the injuries and all that kind of things. And so it allowed me that buffer of not having to talk about it as much and not having to explain, the real reason that I transitioned over. So it definitely helped me in some ways, a little bit of a crutch in other ways, but I've been able to like slowly work at processing some of that over the time I've had over the past few years.
Yeah. Now your injury, I think I read that it's a shoulder injury, right? And it's something that you're, kind of charting and making content is like a big thing for you. Has making content as you're recovering from an injury, has that been therapeutic for you to create this content and have people kind of come along with your journey?
Yeah, it really has been. Like getting messages from other athletes who have been through the same thing, are going through the same thing, or who like have seen my story around it and it's helped them get through their injuries has been like
Hmm.
super super rewarding. And it's something I wish I would have seen when I was going through different injuries in snowboarding. I wish I could have related or just could have connected more with other people who had similar journeys or were going through similar things. I think that would have really helped me. And so now, learning some of these lessons and some of the things I've been through, I try to really share that journey online because you never know who's watching and who could help or who's currently going through it. And I know, I try to say I make the content that I want to see and the content that I wish I could have seen before as well. And so, yeah, it's been really therapeutic as a way to just like kind of express my feelings I like to write. I like to journal. I like to create videos. So that's, kind of a way that I express the things that I'm going through. But also then, yeah, that feedback and the community aspect of talking with other people and the relatability is also really, really beneficial for me personally.
Hmm. So, what made you start a podcast, start creating content that you wanted to see? Where did all of that come from? I guess where did the inspiration come from to do all the different things that you're involved in? I mean, for the people listening, we'll have a shout out portion of this, but should head to her website because there's a ton of things that are on there that we see you doing. Where did the inspiration come from for you to get into all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, documenting the journey has always been a big thing for me. Social media was still kind of in its early days when I was snowboarding, so I wasn't documenting quite as much, apart from a lot of people, a lot of people just kind of sharing the highlights. But it was a way that I actually was able to fund a lot of my snowboard career, was getting sponsorships and doing things online with social media and figuring out that whole world. And then as social media has gained popularity, as I've, kind of found my voice a little bit more, I started creating more stuff about different things. As I started feeling more comfortable opening up about past things that I went through in snowboarding with mental health, stuff like that, I was able to, I was able to feel more comfortable sharing about it, and then seeing that response and seeing that it was helping people and making an impact, and then how that actually helped me, and in turn with feeling like, wow, okay, I wasn't alone with this. There's a community of other people who feel the same, and feeling that support really, really helped me. And then I think the pandemic kind of expedited it all with TikTok, especially. I just felt, I like to make short videos, kind of document things. We all had a lot more time over the pandemic. And so I started feeling a lot more comfortable speaking to the camera, a lot more comfortable sharing more, even more, unpacking more layers of things that I went through, and creating more of a community around that, and connecting with other people who have gone through similar things. And so that's really where it stemmed from. And then same thing with the podcast, was just, especially with the pandemic, I actually had started the podcast and then stopped it a few years before the pandemic, but I restarted it right when it started by doing these Instagram lives once a week, when I think it was like the last week of March that I actually started doing that, because I was noticing a lot of negativity, right? All the businesses are closed, gyms are closed, people aren't training, people aren't traveling. And so I thought, all my friends who are athletes and who are coaches, they're at home. So they have time, and I want to connect with them, selfishly, because I'm at home, I'm bored, I want to have these conversations. And then I was like, why not, share them and have them in public and have people be able to interact. At that time, I was doing them live, interact and engage, and be able to ask questions to these people that maybe they wouldn't usually be able to, or have the time to be able to, and inspire people and see what people are doing during this time, and to stay positive and work on their mindset, and give specific tools. For example, we had Justin Sue, an incredible sports psychologist, come on. He's the team mental performance coach for the Tampa Bay Rays, and he came on and gave a lot of tips about the athlete transition, but also around staying positive during the pandemic, and all these types of things that I could see was like, okay, people can learn things from this person, I'm learning things through this person. And so continuing that, it was, yeah, a little bit of just selfishly needing that outlet of talking to people and having that conversation. It was almost like a therapy hour for me every week, and then sharing that with other people, and hearing that they're experiencing the same things through listening back.
Mhm. So when you started to, create content, but also you're competing, you're in, all these different CrossFit things and all these CrossFit competitions. When you start to kind of unpack these layers and you're on the road creating content at these CrossFit competitions, did people start to recognize you? And, what was it like when you first, got to these CrossFit competitions as somebody who was already in a professional sport yourself?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of my content has definitely, like, I guess, gained more popularity in the, since my injury, really. So I haven't yet actually got to like get out there and compete again, but I've been going, watching my friends at different competitions. I was actually just I was in DC, I guess, like a month ago, watching NWSL, so women's soccer game, and I got recognized, and someone asked for my picture. It was crazy, and it was so cool, because oftentimes, sometimes your videos don't reach a lot of people. Some days, you're uploading something to the internet and you're getting these comments, and you definitely like, oh wow, like this is helping someone, or this is this, or but seeing someone in real life and them telling you face to face, like, when you posted this video, that really impacted me, or this inspired me to do this in my life, like, it's just a whole different world. And so that means the world to me. It's like such a cool feeling, and that's been amazing. And then, yeah, going back to CrossFit competitions and stuff like that. Yeah, and the question that you asked, maybe I'll answer it in a different way, perhaps than you had asked it, about going across the competitions after, coming from like a professional level in a different sport. For me, it was hard going from, yeah, like maybe being known in a different sport to coming to this new one and like starting from scratch and being like, okay, I am used to a certain level of training, competing, having a team around me, professionality. And now I'm going back to what it was in my come up in snowboarding of competing at more local events, having to work through that whole process. So it's been an experience. It's a hard experience to go back and relearn. But I think I've been doing that constantly in my career in different ways, like when I all of a sudden had a coach and had to relearn different things. So I think it's just a healthy process, honestly, to take some steps back to be able to make some more steps forward.
Yeah. Before we get to our 5 questions portion, I kind of wanted to know, how's the shoulder doing, and when are we going to see you competing again?
Yeah, I mean, the shoulder's good. I got fully cleared, unfortunately, like just weeks after the competition season started for CrossFit. So I was basically like, I kind of knew a year in advance that I would not be good to go for the season. So it's almost been like 3 years that I've been kind of out. So it's longer than a lot of my snowboard injuries. But I wanted to be safe and take it easy, and just like knowing that I'm not like super young anymore in sports. So I can't just push through things and go. It's like, okay, if I re-injure this, will I actually ever come back to sport? So it's like, let's take the time to heal, to make sure that I can, lengthen my career, because I don't know if I can go through a whole other rehab process of 3 years again. So yeah, I took that time. Some opportunities came up to actually, like, I'm running the New York Marathon next month. So that opportunity came up. So all of a sudden now I'm just running a ton. And then my goal is to get back to CrossFit competition. The season starts in February, and that's like the first qualifier. And then from there, you kind of qualify to the next level and the next level, and so on. There's a few like different politics behind the scenes that I'm figuring out, because I want to compete on a team, but the team has to decide who's going to be on it. And I'm in the middle of marathon training, so I'm not necessarily in my peak CrossFit condition, but I'm really hoping that I can kind of prove myself, get on this team, because they're amazing athletes, and they've competed twice at the CrossFit Games, which is like the world championships of CrossFit. It's the highest level that you can possibly get to. So to be able to be part of that team would be absolutely incredible, and like a dream come true. If I can be part of that team, we can qualify again. That would be amazing. So yeah, I'm kind of in like this mixed zone of like, oh my God, I have a marathon in 3 weeks, and I need to get right back into, full CrossFit training, so that I can try to prove it to them before the end of the year that I deserve a spot on this team. So yeah, crossing my fingers that things go well with balancing those two things. But if so, then hopefully I'll be, full force competing, next season, which starts in the winter and extends all the way to August.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to our 5 questions. And the first one that I have for you is kind of a 3-part answer is what I'm looking for. And it's, it applies to all of the sports that you've played. So who is somebody in hockey, somebody in snowboarding, and somebody in CrossFit that you have looked up to?
Yeah, in hockey, I mean, like Hayley Wickenheiser and Cassie Campbell, they're like Canadian hockey legends. They don't play, like, they're retired now, but Cassie Campbell was an incredible leader. She was like the captain of the women's team when I was kind of coming up looking at hockey. And then Hayley Wickenheiser was kind of like our goal scorer, our just equally a leader, just an awesome human. Now she's like a doctor, and she works for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So she's just an awesome woman in sport and just inspiring women in general. So yeah, that's hockey. In snowboarding, I always looked up to, there was, Jamie Anderson. She was a rider who she rides, just the way she rides, it's effortless. She's still the best snowboarder, and she was the best snowboarder before I started competing. So for her to be still competing against these like young kids and like still make it look so easy is just insane, mind-boggling to me. And I always thought it was funny because we both were Billabong athletes, and I always would order the same gear as her, not on purpose, but because that was like my favorite jacket combo, would always end up being the same stuff that she had. So I show up at the same competitions as her and have to compete against her in the same gear. And I just always felt like I was such a fangirl, but it really is like the comfiest stuff. But yeah, so she's awesome. And then when it comes to CrossFit, I mean, there's so many, like even just like my training partners, like one of my training partner, like he's a dad and he's training all the time, all day with me and just working really hard. And he's gone to the CrossFit Games twice. And then obviously the woman who's won, I think she just won 6 years in a row. So she's like the most dominant force in CrossFit. I really like her story because you could see her coming second place, and she actually in one of there's like a documentary, and she was in first place and then she ended up coming second, but you can see that she was kind of broken mentally in a moment where they interviewed her, where she was like, I don't deserve this first place jersey, I'm going to lose it after this event. Like, she just didn't have that confidence in that moment. And then now, if she's a whole different person, like she's won 6 years back to back, and she's like the most confident person. Like, she will call her shot and then do it, and she's just like untouchable. So it's been interesting to like watch that journey and be inspired by, wow, okay, mindset is a huge part of sport and you can really work on it.
Yeah. So next question is, throughout all the different sports that you've played, what's a memory for you that had the biggest impact?
Yeah, it's definitely that run that I landed when I was 17 at that competition that I had lost the year before, because my mom, unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it to the competition. I think she was working or something, but my dad was there and my brother was there, and he actually, like, the competition course itself is roped off until like after the last feature, and then you kind of ride out and you can ride back down the rest of the mountain kind of with everyone else. And my brother was skiing down the side of the run. And so after I landed that last jump, I knew, like, I was like, I've seen what everyone else was doing all day. And I was like, I was pretty sure, like, wow, if I landed that, like, that could win it. And so I was like, I landed it. And I just remember like being so in the flow state and then coming out, and like my brother, like we have such a brother sister relationship where we're always chirping each other, but like when it really matters, like we care for each other and we're there. And so he like high fived me, and like we just like rode the rest of the run down, just like so pumped and so excited, because like he knew like that could have been the winning run too. And like that was just such a really cool moment.
Mm-hmm. What's a sports figure, whether it's in your sport or not, that you've listened to, had an impact on you, that has resonated for you throughout your entire career?
Ooh, throughout my entire career. I mean, there's a lot of people now, I would say, but they're, they haven't been competing as long as I was looking up to them when I was a kid. But, someone like Serena Williams, like she's been competing forever. And she's always just been so inspiring of, how she carries herself, how she's expressed her emotions, and it's like opened the door for a lot of women athletes to not feel like they need to like repress their emotions when they're playing. They can like be confident, they can scream, like you can just be yourself in whatever sport you're doing. And then what she's doing now, in the business side and different things, it inspires me. So I would say she's someone who's I've always kind of like looked up to throughout my career, and she's someone who's still crushing it at what she's doing.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of touched on it, and you're doing the New York Marathon, and you want to get back to competing with CrossFit and everything else. But what's a goal of yours that you would like to accomplish, either in the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years? But what's like the top goal on your list?
Oof, you know what? It's just I think just make an impact on the next generation of women athletes, whether that's from the business side of, working in creating content, working in investing in different women's sports ventures, things like that. That's definitely big goals of mine, or making an impact through my own career and sharing my journey, and sharing different lessons and also like mistakes that I've made along the way. Hopefully that can make a little bit of an impact as well.
Mm-hmm. So last question, same one that everyone gets. What is a piece of advice, something that somebody told you, or something that, you've read from another athlete, maybe it is Serena or somebody else, or something that you've learned throughout your career that has really stuck with you, that you feel that next generation should know?
Yeah, something my aunt said to me. She's like, "You're a human being, not a human doing." And that really resonated with me, especially when my identity was so tied to my accomplishments, to the sport I was doing, to being an athlete, and just remembering like, no, I'm a human being, not a human doing. It's like who I am and just experiencing and living life that like really matters more than, judging myself or my worth based on my output or my title or the certain role or whatever that is. And so I think that's something that can help anyone, but especially athletes who get so closely tied to their results, to the team that they're on, to how many playing minutes they're getting, to how many gold medals they have, to where they're at in their career, or just to being an athlete in general, is like, just remember you're a human being, not a human doing.
That's awesome. That's a great saying. Now, before we let you go, I want to kind of give you the chance. Let us know where we can find you. What's the name of your podcast, website, and everything else?
Yeah, Natalie Allport, natalieallport.com, at Natalie Allport on social media. And then my podcast is called the All In Podcast. Took a break for like the end of summer, fall, but we're actually going to be back next week. So make sure to check it out.
It's awesome. Natalie, this has been great. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. It's always awesome to talk to people that come from so many different backgrounds, and yours is definitely the most different that I've even had on the show. So it's been really, really great. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Do you have anything for us before we let you go?
Oh, I really appreciate that. Just, thanks for having me on. And that's pretty much it. And definitely, snowboarding is a unique path, but I think there's lessons from every sport that transfer over.
Thanks, Natalie. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. To make sure you don't miss when a new episode comes your way, head to the Athletes to Athletes YouTube page to like and subscribe, or to Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast. Again, we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you again next time.